Thank you for joining me for this Rectory Roots program, which is presented in celebration of Rectory's centennial year, Rectory having been founded 100 years ago in 1920. My name is Lisa Levesque, and I'm coming to you from the archives room on the first floor of the Deal House on the Rectory School campus. Rectory Roots programs are illustrated journeys through Rectory's 100-year history. Along each journey, we view early photographs, retell eyewitness and newspaper accounts, and display a few artifacts that have been discovered in the school archives. In this episode, our journey is the discovery of the origins and continuing story of Rectory's learning services. It's a narrative that takes us from remedial reading instruction to a comprehensive program of support and enrichment services. The building I am in, the Deal House, is 120 years old. Built in 1900, it is one of 5 buildings on the Rectory campus listed on the National Register of Historic Places. However, as I look out the windows of this archives room, I can see the newest building on campus, the John and Millie Green Hall, named for Rectory's 3rd headmaster and his wife. Rectory's Learning Services in 2021 has its own centralized location in the airy and brightly lit spaces of this building, which houses the Hale Elementary School on the 1st floor and the Smith Learning Center on the 2nd. Before Green Hall was dedicated in 2017, perhaps you remember tutoring in nooks and crannies all over the Rectory campus, including basements, the library, or even the 3rd floor of the Grosvenor House, affectionately called the Tutor Tower. Today, Rectory's Learning Services Department provides tiers of services across a multitude of subjects and for various learning needs, whether remedial, support, or enrichment. As we look back in time to Rectory's roots, we realize that this comprehensive array of services grows out of the Bigelow family's understanding of how fundamentally important it is for students to be able to read. This is where our first chapter in the story of Rectory's Learning Services begins. And it is the Bigelow's own words that laid the groundwork for our travels. Since reading is the basis of all scholastic learning, that is to say, learning's chief tool, the importance of teaching each child to read well is obvious. So now let's step into our time machine and travel back to Rectory's first decade in the 1920s, when its founders, Frank Bigelow, the Episcopal minister of Christ Church, Pomfret, and his wife Mabel, decide to care for and tutor a young boy who was about the same age as their own 10-year-old son, John. And here they are, John Bigelow on the left and George Chandler Holt are Rectory's first 2 students. And in the next year, 1921, Rectory School is listed in Porter Sargent's A Handbook of American Private Schools as a small home school for a limited number of boys between 6 and 12 years of age. Frank and Mabel have 2 children, Elizabeth and John. And although both siblings will play seminal roles in the development of the reading programs that grow to become Rectory's Learning Services, it is with the Bigelow's daughter, Elizabeth, where our story begins. In 1927, with an increasing enrollment and having acquired a large property on which to nurture a school, Father Bigelow decides to resign his rectorship so that he can devote himself full-time to the growing school. His words, as written in the 2nd issue of the Rectory News, declare, "The school now is established. 6 years ago, it was an experiment." It is also in 1927 that the Bigelow's daughter Elizabeth graduates from Smith College and comes to teach at her parents' school. Her brother John is 5 years younger than Elizabeth and still in secondary school at Kent School in Kent, Connecticut. In 1930, Elizabeth pursues a master's degree at Teachers College, Columbia University, where Dr. Samuel Orton, a noted neuropsychiatrist, is researching speech and reading. At this time, Dr. Orton's theoretical work in the field of language disabilities is just beginning to have practical influence on the teaching of reading. As we shall see, Dr. Orton's findings play a long and influential role in Rectory's history of providing learning services. Upon completing her advanced degree, Elizabeth returns to Rectory, and early written histories of the school reveal that her scholastic interest in students who have difficulty with reading is a genesis of specialized support for Rectory students. From a 1941 Rectory News account, we learn, from the time of her marriage in 1933, Elizabeth, now Mrs. Abbott, has specialized in the teaching of English and reading. Finding that there always were a few boys who had difficulty with reading, Mrs. Abbott became interested in remedial work in this subject. And under her guidance, this special work in reading has been developed through the years until we now have a well-planned program in remedial reading for those boys who need it. During the ensuing years of the 1930s, Elizabeth holds the roles of director of the lower school, educational director, and head of the remedial reading program. School catalogs from the 1930s list faculty members and their degrees, and we quickly discover that a prominent credential during this time is studied remedial reading at Boston University under Dr. Durrell in the Durrell-Sullivan Educational Clinic. As an undergraduate, Dr. Durrell worked with Dr. Orton, and after completing a doctoral degree, he opened an educational clinic that served as a methods lab for remedial readers. In the 1930s, Doctors Orton and Durrell's development of the instructional implications of their work positions Rectory to be an early adopter of evidence-based techniques in remedial reading. Techniques that are a good fit with the Bigelow's founding belief in providing individual care to each child. Here is how the Bigelows explained it in 1938. We began early in our career to give individual instruction. As we learned more and more about the remedial reading work done at great educational centers, we studied the results of their experiments and have applied them to our own work. Finding that something could be done about school failure due to an inability to read, we have given a great deal of our time and energy to it. And so by 1940, we find in the Rectory School Catalog, Course of Study. Reading handicaps and other difficulties are studied, and individual tutoring is given when needed. A trained reading tutor gives her entire time to working with individual boys. If the first chapter, spanning from the late 1920s through the early 1940s, in Rectory's growth of specialized learning services belongs to Elizabeth Bigelow, the second chapter belongs to her brother John. Graduating from Harvard in 1933, having majored in French literature, John comes to teach at Rectory and relieve his father of some of the administrative duties of the school. A short 4 years later, however, in 1937, Father Bigelow passes away, and John becomes the school's second headmaster. It is John Bigelow with whom history will credit the formalizing of a tutoring program for students in need of language training. His is a story intertwined with a long association with the Orton Society, which today is recognized as the International Dyslexia Association, and with Dr. and Mrs. Samuel Orton, who are described as two of the most important individuals in the history of dyslexia. The Orton papers in the Columbia University archives reveal that in the 20 years between 1928 and 1948, while in private practice treating individuals with reading and writing difficulties, the Ortons see or consult on over 2,000 cases. One of those cases is the beginning of the Ortons' association with John Bigelow and the Rectory School because John meets Sam Orton when a Rectory student is referred to the Ortons for diagnostic testing. John Bigelow's headmaster's letters in the Rectory News give us contemporaneous accounts of Rectory's tutorial sessions in the mid-1940s. He writes, "All the boys at Rectory have the advantage of an unusual amount of personal attention in the classroom, for all of our classes are relatively small. Moreover, special tutorial periods are provided. We are undertaking to give not a little individual tutoring. Authorities on the subject estimate that 40% of present-day school children have some sort of reading disability. It is natural, therefore, that we should have a few at Rectory, and for these pupils we are providing as much individual attention as could well be given in any school which is not strictly a tutoring school." Following on the groundwork laid in the 1930s by his sister Elizabeth's interest in remedial reading, John Bigelow grows Rectory's program for helping children who need specialized teaching and learning how to read. In our archives, a recent recollection of an alum who was here in the 1940s illustrates Rectory's growing reputation in the field of dyslexia amongst reading therapists as well as parents seeking help for their children. During my 5th grade at the nearby public brick school, my next step of education had already been in the making. Unknown to me, arrangements were being made for me to go away to school. It was years later that I was informed about the meaning of dyslexia. It seems that Mom and Dad had done some research, and the Rectory School in Pomfret, Connecticut was recommended for the next step of my education. My venue was to be in New England. In the mid-1940s, the Orton suggests that John Bigelow utilized the testing services of consulting psychologists Page Sharp and his wife Laura, noted as experts in the field of language disabilities, because Mr. Sharp's office in Hartford, Connecticut is much closer to Rectory School than Dr. Orton's practice in New York City. The Sharps' leadership and involvement with Rectory School over the next 36 years, from 1948 to 1984, guide and shape its specialized services, specifically with the adoption of the Orton-Gillingham approach to remediating reading and writing. During the Sharps' tenure, Rectory's tutoring program becomes known as language training or retraining. After her husband's death in the 1960s, the language retraining program is placed under the direction of Laura Sharp, a position she holds until her retirement in 1984. A tutor who started teaching at Rectory in the 1960s describes the intensive focus on the reading program under Laura Sharp. Here are her words. At that time at Rectory and tutoring, the emphasis was on language training, using the Orton-Gillingham book, Remedial Training for Children with Specific Disability in Reading, Spelling, and Penmanship, by Anna Gillingham and Bessie Stillman. After Laura Sharp became director of the language retraining program, our job as tutors was to teach students how to handle language, teach them how to read, how to spell. We were not to do homework with them. The thrust was on remediation of language difficulties. Another tutor who was here in the 1980s tells us, as a tutor, I was fascinated with my exposure to the Orton-Gillingham method. For me, it was like studying my own first language as if it were a foreign language. Although Laura Sharp was a daunting figure, the methods she taught us to help our students were simply amazing. With the Orton approach in continued use at Rectory for 80 years, one can imagine that its archives contain many Orton-related teaching materials and manuals. And it does, including June Orton's book, A Guide to Teaching Phonics, several editions of the Gillingham Manual, phonetic word cards, Anna Gillingham's jewel case, and other Orton-Gillingham materials. Also in the archives is a large sheaf of correspondence, evidence of the close kinship and involvement that John Bigelow and the Rectory School have had with the Orton Society, which was created in 1948 by June Orton to continue her husband's work and legacy. In this thick manila folder are to be found letters between John Bigelow and at least 4 presidents of the Orton Society, including its founder and first president June Orton, as well as other well-known names in the field. John Bigelow was treasurer of the Orton Society from 1960 to 1972, and Pomfret, Connecticut is the Society's business address. All requests for pamphlets, books, and materials are answered and sent from Rectory. When in 1967 to 1972, the Orton Society conducts institutes in language retraining, Rectory School is the location for these summer workshops, with graduate-level credit being conferred by the University of Connecticut. A tutor who took the course tells us, a turning point for me came when Margaret Rawson, president of the Orton Society and known internationally as an authority in the field of language disability, taught a course for teachers here at Rectory in the summer of 1967. Finally, our time machine looks in on the Orton Dyslexia Society's annual conference in 1986, when John Britton Bigelow was presented the Society's highest honor with these words to describe his service. An innovator in education of dyslexic youth, and a steadfast, sagacious, and generous guide to the Orton Dyslexia Society from its beginning, and forever its valued advisor. At the time of the Orton Award in 1986, John Bigelow, now in retirement from Rectory and living in Thompson, Connecticut, reminisced about the impact of the Ortons on his time at Rectory. Our association with Dr. and Mrs. Samuel Orton provided us with training for our remedial tutors, diagnosis of students' specific problems, and of course, directions for proceeding with each tutee's instruction. Many an alumnus today will attest to the efficacy of that teaching. In 2021, Rectory continues to train its learning specialists in Orton Gillingham approaches. Although today, research in the field is supported by brain imaging techniques and learning involves advanced assistive technologies. Rectory's initial use of instructional technology is during the information age of the 1960s, when audiovisual and programmed instructional materials are being developed. Dr. Elovich, Rectory's school psychologist over 5 decades, describes this expansion of the language training program. By 1961, Rectory had divided its approach to reading into 2 general categories, remedial and developmental. And our tutor from the 1960s explains, in addition to the language training work with students, there was a remedial reading program, and the school recently had started a developmental reading program with reading machines. This new offering, developmental reading, is designed to build up a student's reading speed and comprehension. Reading accelerators, tachistoscopes, and SRA builders are amongst the equipment. A recent posting of this photograph from the 1960s prompted an alum to send in the following memory to the archives. I was pleasantly surprised to see the pictures of the reading machine I used at Rectory in the mid-60s. I believe it was responsible for the reading prowess I have enjoyed much of my life. I can remember reading Endurance, about the harrowing adventures of Ernest Shackleton trying to reach the South Pole. Written in 1962, here is Robert Berman's close-up view of this reading machine. As soon as you enter the developmental reading room, you see the reading machines. There are 5 of them, each covered with a plastic cover. The first time I used one, I took the covering off and discovered a long upside-down T. I pushed up the T, placed the book on the surface, and put the T on the top of the page. Now the machine was ready. When I flipped the switch, the T started coming down the page. I soon found out that if I did not read fast enough, the T would block my vision. The reading machine forces you to keep your attention on the book and nothing else. It also forces you to read fast, so it will speed your rate of reading. I may say that is certainly the case with me. A recent reflection from an alum who was at Rectory during the Laura Sharp years is what one hopes will be remembered many years later. My parents had the wherewithal to realize I needed some intensive tutoring to improve my reading skills. It was a struggle, but one day the light went on. I wasn't reading the same line over and over. I could finally comprehend what I was reading, and it became a joy to get through an entire book in days instead of a month. It is with Laura Sharp's retirement in 1984 that the 3rd chapter in Rectory's learning services takes off. Here is how one tutor describes the change. During the 1980s, after Laura Sharp left, our focus broadened, and it became okay to help students with study skills and homework. We accommodated the needs of the types of children who were coming to Rectory. In the 1980s, the tutors, although still working with students with dyslexia, now teach organizational and study skills. Term reports on students from the time show us that language principles continue to be taught, now to all students regardless of remedial need. But the tutors also pay attention to study habits, such as organization of materials, notations in assignment notebook, ability to follow directions, attitude in class, and response to criticism or suggestions. An accompanying name change marks the trajectory of the expansion. No longer language training. The program is referred to as the Individualized Instruction Program, or IIP, and it becomes common to refer to the services as tutoring and the teachers as tutors. By the 2000s, again with a change in directorship of the program, Individualized Instruction expands its programmatic offerings to serve all Rectory students, including gifted and advanced placement. In addition, IIP now supports students diagnosed with attention deficit, auditory processing, executive functioning, written expression, and to a lesser extent, dyscalculia. Small group classes for academic credit are available for students who need math instruction outside of the regular course offerings, whether basic or advanced. Also, IIP develops and oversees courses with students from more than one grade level when the student's learning paces and support needs necessitate differentiation in content and instructional approach beyond that typically used in a grade level classroom. No longer marketed primarily as a remedial and support program, Individualized Instruction provides structured time for a student who wants advanced writing practice or an exploration into what it would take to colonize Mars. To foster an understanding that the Individualized Instruction Program's services offer more than language remediation or helping with homework, the tutors are referred to as IIP specialists, and students and teachers proudly wear lapel badges sporting the phrase, "I am an IPE," or "I am NIPper." The department is known for a carefully selected match between a student's needs and the IPPER's strengths. Here, one student recalls his work with his IIP specialist. Some of my most cherished memories at school come from my tutoring sessions. From the very first moment I stepped into her tutoring room, my tutor assured me that, however intimidating the academic work felt to me, we would get through everything together. No matter how difficult it was for me to comprehend the academic material at hand, she never gave up trying to guide me. I saw how dedicated she was to my success, so I made a choice to always give my very best and never give up in regards to comprehending my schoolwork. She instilled in me self-belief, self-confidence, and a curious mind yearning to learn. And an IIP specialist of the time writes, "Tutoring was and is the lifeblood of learning at Rectory. Once the tutor and the student sat down together, we entered a world that very few had the privilege of knowing. We entered a world of partnership. We might have started with a missing assignment book. We might have spent much of the period tracking down homework questions and then coaxing a few responses. But jagged starts, forward and backward, gradually led to progress. And no matter where we started in the process of learning, we ended up in a better place. Sometimes those days revolved around larger questions. Why do I have to do this? What is the point? I tried to give students the long view. What is your goal here? I would ask them. Tutoring was about establishing truth, honesty, and openness. The strength of Rectory tutoring was about one student and one teacher working together at whatever that student needed. It was about showing students that they could succeed. It was about the fundamental truth of teaching. Go to where the students are and bring them where you want them to be. Tutoring made that truth possible. Over the past decade, many of Rectory's student-centered programs have been brought under the umbrella of the Learning Services Department. Formal accommodation plans, diagnostic testing, enrichment sessions, study hall support, flexible seating, foreign language alternatives, reinforcement of reading and study skills, remedial reading lessons for elementary students, and provision for counseling all may be arranged within the walls of the Henry B. Smith Learning Center. Supporting elementary and middle school students, 17 full-time and 10 part-time learning specialists provide one-to-one or small group instruction. Specialists have advanced training in English language learning, reading instruction, or language processing. Current Director Rebecca Paget-Mungai has our final words on Rectory's learning services.
As many students that we have in IIP, which is about over half the school population, that's many ways that IIP looks. It could be learning how to stay organized all the way to doing like advanced math because that's what you need. So I think the main thing is no matter what you come in IIP for, you're going to work with someone who knows how to support you, but they're also going to push you to be a part of your own academic journey too. Like what role do you want to play as a young person in developing your goals for yourself? And are you going to, be able to stay consistent with that? And how do we encourage you? And how do we help you with setbacks and all of those things? So it's putting the kid in the driver's seat with a partnership with an adult. And that's the IIP.
As our time machine arrives back at the Deal House, I hear Father Bigelow's words from 1928. To all the students who have been at the Rectory School, our love to you wherever you are. You are welcome here always, and we are happy when you send us news of your comings and goings. Just as Father Bigelow's heartfelt words were true 100 years ago, so are they true today. Our centennial weekend will be next spring in 2022, and we hope to see all of you on campus as we celebrate at a centennial gala. Happy anniversary, Rectory School! We look forward to your next 100 years, even as we explore your past. Sharing our stories, sharing our lives. Centennial spirit, centennial pride. Thank you for continuing to share your lives with Rectory. See you next spring.